I recently did an interview with the Jesus Way podcast. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. I'll put the link in the description. It lasted almost 2 hours. The host, Aaron Abke, and his associate Cameron Waters, who co-produced the film Christspiracy that many of you might know about. Look it up, christspiracy.com if you've never heard about it. And we addressed the question, what would be the relationship of the Jesus movement, as we call it, John the Baptist, Jesus, James, the early Jewish followers of Jesus, to the Dead Sea Scroll community? After all, from the city of Jerusalem, it's only about 15 to 20 miles down to the Dead Sea, to the area of Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So the geography is very close. But what about the two movements? How do they compare? So here's an excerpt, it's about half an hour, of my main presentation that then we discuss for an hour and a half or so. So be sure you go and watch the whole thing, but I thought this central presentation would set the stage. Enjoy.
I'm going to kick it to you, Cam. We obviously we want to talk to you, Dr. Tabor, about your expertise in early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've done a lot of work on that, as you know, as well, and I've talked to you a lot about some of our research and findings with just connecting a lot of threads of this sectarian group in Qumran, and then we have the Jesus movement of the same time in the first century. There seem to be a lot of threads here that are begging to be connected. So, Cam, where would you want to kick us off today on this conversation?
Well, I think if we could start with the Dead Sea Scroll material and look into it to find, Dr. Tabor, the connections that you draw specifically to whether it's John the Baptist, Jesus, early Christianity, just so that we can further understand how, how connected these groups are. Is it a possibility that John the Baptist, say, or Jesus emerged from this kind of thinking? And what is it? Is there language that connects it? Are there practices that connected? Like, what are the threads that we could draw?
It's a great topic. I'm going to show you something here that I brought. When I started at Chicago in graduate school, this was my Dead Sea Scroll book in English. It's by Vermish. Some of you have the latest edition. And then I went to this. Notice we're getting larger. And then I went to this by the time I was teaching at Notre Dame and later William and Mary. Yep. And now we use this, although I think yours might have a different cover if you, but it's the ultimate complete edition in English. So look at the difference. I love comparing these. Whoops. I love comparing these in terms of size. So look at that. Now, why do I show that? Just that we have more scrolls? No. I show that because just about everything I'm going to say right now is from the early scrolls, meaning the basic ideas and seeds of the movement we've had since 1947, 8, 9, certainly by 1950. So we keep refining and adding and getting other texts. And of course, we want all of those. But it's not as though this hasn't been around since the 40s, really, of the previous century. So, Cam, here's how I'm going to ask your question. Don't answer, but I'm going to address your question, or just who are they? What are they? I'm going to describe a group to you. I'm not going to tell you which group I'm describing, okay? And don't say anything, just listen. I'm going to mention characteristics. There are actually 12, but you don't need to count them, just listen. Let each one sink in. An apocalyptic group, a group that thinks they're very near the end, the time is at hand kind of group. A messianic group, not only do they think the time is at hand, they believe the coming of the Davidic Messiah is very near, if not, in some cases, even having arrived. They're a group that if you could stop them and say, what are you doing? And this is all from the early scrolls. What are you doing? What's your purpose? We are fulfilling Isaiah 40, verse 3, about a voice crying in the wilderness and the desert, prepare the way of the Lord. That sounds familiar. Okay. It gets better. They're a group that would say, you want another description of us? We like to call ourselves the people of the new covenant. Jeremiah 31:31. I'm going to call Israel and Judah back together and make a new covenant. We're the people of the new covenant. You see how that goes with apocalyptic, messianic, preparing the way. They also use a phrase that's used nowhere else except in two movements I know of. Again, we're not giving names. Children of light and children of darkness. You'd think that would be all over the place. Like Hebrew Bible? Nope. Apocrypha? Nope. Pseudepigrapha? Nope. But the group I'm talking about uses that term as a self-designation. We are the children of light. They practice water purification or immersion as an initiation into their group. Now, all forms of observant Judaism, down to our own day, have water purification rites. Even a Reformed synagogue today would have a mikveh, a ritual pool of immersion. It can be for various purposes, for women after their period, all kinds of things that are in the Torah and the Hebrew Bible. If you've been to a funeral, if you touch a dead body, different kinds of ritual. But this group actually says, no, come down to the riverside and dip yourself in the water and be born again. And when you rise from the water, you'll be a new person. You will walk in a new life. They believe in a prophet or teacher like Moses. Remember Deuteronomy? I will send someday, Moses declares, a prophet like me, to whom the Lord speaks face to face. And Deuteronomy ends by saying that's never happened. Never had one of those. So it's not referring to, as great as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the prophets were, they're not the prophet like Moses. This group thinks that God is going to send such a one, and in fact, they think he has sent such a one, and they have a teacher that they believe is the prophet like Moses. I'm starting to get an idea of who this might be. They emphasize the Holy Spirit inspiring and leading them. Of course, they study the Hebrew scriptures. We're talking about a Jewish group here. They have a council of 12 that leads them and an inner council of 3. Man, this is getting really familiar to me. I do this with my class. It's just a joke, but you get it, right? By this time, they're laughing like, no, what's he talking about? Jesus, we know. Maybe. They sell their possessions and have communal living. They consider the Jerusalem temple and the priesthood corrupt and the sacrifices as never intended by God. They like phrases like, from the beginning, it has not been so. They love that. About marriage, about worship, about what God requires. It's like they're an Eden kind of group. They want to go back to the beginning. Finally, and I could do more, but 12's, I like 12. They consider prayer as their sacrifice, and this could even be 13. If you're offering prayer as your sacrifice, where are you going to do it? In your temple, which is you. Now, believe it or not, that might describe Jeremiah, if you know him well enough. He's the one who talked about the new covenant, and God never wanted sacrifice and so on. But you asked me in the time of Jesus, right? Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think everybody's got the point. I just described both groups, right? Is there anything in that list that does not apply to Jesus or the Dead Sea group? No. So right away, if you approach it that way, I think we're going to have to agree there's some sort of merging, overlap, and so forth, but are they the same group? That's the question. And since the scrolls were first put out in this form, because these are mainly from Cave 1 and a few things from Cave 4, I mean, there's quite a bit here, but you can get the whole portrait from the early scrolls, the sectarian scrolls. Now, they have copies of the Bible, they have copies of other books as well, but what we call the community's text, that from this believing community would be kind of like we would say a New Testament. It's not exactly the same, but in other words, books that they follow and write that they believe come from their teacher. Now, we don't know his name. I would date him about 100 years before Jesus. That's really important to remember, because one of the problems we get into is if I go to this volume of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you say, well, you say they don't have sacrifices, but I found some texts in here where it seems like maybe some of them did have sacrifices and so forth. And what we have to realize is that this is not a monolithic group that was static for 200 years. They start first century BCE. Some scholars even put them earlier. I go with a scholar by the name of Michael Wise. In my opinion, this is the best book ever written on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I wish I had written it. And it's also the best title ever for a book on the scrolls. The First Messiah. Michael Wise, great Dead Sea Scroll scholar. And what Michael says is it's a first century BC movement that goes all the way down through the time of Jesus, down to 70, but then even survives past that. And that's what we're going to get into tonight, I think, later as we go along. This what survived from this whole movement, but it's not a monolithic movement. Just as with any movement, there can be more liberal, as we say, approaches. For example, if you read the writings of the teacher himself, they're led by a teacher of righteousness, they call him. It probably should be translated the true teacher, the right teacher. John Reeves, a great Dead Sea scholar, has argued that it's not just that he's the teacher of righteousness, but he's the Moreh Tzedek, the true teacher. And they actually call him sometimes the true teacher. So that's sort of the idea. Jesus said, come to me. Say, come to me and learn. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Now, does he mean like I personally, ontologically, or does he mean I'm representing that way? This group would say they're representing that way. Now, let me add, before we jump further into this, none of those things apply to Pharisees or Sadducees. This should like knock us out. We should stop the broadcast right now and say, what? I mean, think of Judaism in the time of Jesus. Traditionally, we say Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, right? But Essene then becomes a kind of a catch-all for dissident groups that aren't really Pharisees or Sadducees. In other words, I just described a Jesus movement and the teachers movement, let's call it. We don't know his name. The teachers movement and Jesus movement, which is also the teachers movement, and the John the Baptist and the James movement, because they're with Jesus and his movement. And the Pharisees and Sadducees don't share any of these things. So that alone puts them in a category of overlap, not just the characteristics, but it's not as though, well, 3 of these things the Pharisees liked and 4 of the Sadducees. No, they didn't like any of these things. None of them. As far as we can tell, we don't have a lot from the Pharisees. There's much more we could parallel and expand, but even these titles unfold. For example, if I say apocalyptic group, they're into the book of Daniel. All these groups are into the book of Daniel. And what do I mean the book of Daniel? Particularly chapter 9, that there's a final 490-year period, 10 jubilees. They thought a jubilee was 49 years. They're really into that. The Jesus movement's into that. They think the countdown is near. The appointed time has grown very short. Even Paul, we're going to talk about Paul, he's into this too. In that sense, he's a different kind of Essene, if you want to call him that. So people get all tangled up about the language. Essene is probably the most generic term you could use for these dissident groups. I was talking to you, Aaron, before we started, just chatting a little bit. I also work on groups in the Middle Ages that dissent from the Roman Catholic Church, right? And Cam's worked on these groups as well. They go by all sorts of names, and like the Hussites, the Taborites, the Cathars. But what do they all have in common? They tend to be critical of the religious establishment, the power, the riches, the wealth, the corruption. They call themselves the poor ones, poor in spirit, as well as sharing their goods. They tend to be vegetarian. They tend to believe that Jesus is the teacher, not God. They're clear about who God is and so forth. So this is a movement that I think even goes back into the Hebrew Bible. I jokingly said, maybe we should call Jeremiah an Essene. Depends on what you mean by Essene. But today people have it down. There are three groups: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, and the Dead Sea Scroll group are the Essenes, as if it's this watertight compartment. Well, it's not very watertight, since I just listed 12 things that the Jesus movement shares too. So I would say this. I don't think they're card-carrying Qumranites necessarily, but they share many of the perspectives that I just named. By Qumranites, I mean the people that were out at Qumran. But you know what? We have no idea. Why? Because these scrolls were written 50, 100 years before the time of Jesus, when we have the group at Qumran during his day. And we have no way of knowing what that group, let's say if we could drop down in the year 20, 25, 30 AD or CE, and we visit Qumran. My students always ask me, I take people to Qumran all the time. I've dug there, I've excavated there, I've been in all the caves. Could Jesus have come here? Now, if I pick up this book and say, and read it all, there's things in it that don't sound like Jesus. For example, if my lamb falls in a pit on the Sabbath, can I help it out? Because I mean a pit, like a deep well. You're going to have to get ropes and people and something to pull the ropes, and you're going to have all these people together and build a kind of a pulley thing, and it's going to take your whole Sabbath to save that little lamb. What if the little lamb broke its leg and is crying? You get back in the assembly and do not leave the camp, and after the Sabbath, you take care of the lamb. Okay, that sounds kind of strict, right? But it's keeping the Sabbath. Jesus says, because he actually brings this up in Luke, which of you, having a lamb falling in a pit, would not help it out even on the Sabbath? The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. How do we know that by the time of Jesus, that original, more conservative group, over 100 years, 150 years, had not been influenced by some of their apocalyptic disappointments? Groups change, groups merge, they have breakaways. So, yeah, I think Jesus could have spoken at the assembly at Qumran in the room there, because I'm not going to put him back 150 years earlier and judge him by everything that's in some of the scrolls. So we need to take a broad approach, and yet not so broad that we don't see how specific these things are. The things I named are not broad. They're very specific. What's your interpretation of Daniel 9? What's your interpretation of Daniel 11? Who do you think the man of sin is? When do you think he's coming? Who's the teacher? Who's the Messiah? What will he be like? What's the Messianic? They're all discussing these things for 150 years. Broadly, of course, the Jesus movement, the Essenes, are incredibly similar, but we can't get hung up on names. I don't know what Essene means. My guess is it probably means the doers. the doers, the Osim HaTorah. Osim HaTorah, listen, Osim Esin, maybe. That's my best guess. And I didn't come up with that, others have. And what does Jesus say? Don't be hearers, but Esin, Osim HaTorah, be doers of the Torah, not hearers only. But also he said new covenant. And he also said prepare, it says prepare the way in the wilderness. So what we want to talk about is what are the overlaps, broadly speaking, in all of our sources that reflect this kind of piety. And I would want to go back to Isaiah, Jeremiah, the prophets. I think you two have done a lot, haven't you, with having Ross Nichols on and others who trace things all the way through, maybe even back to the time of Moses. That there's, I talked to Cam in his film Christspiracy about a blue thread. I like blue, not red. It's a blue thread that goes through of what does God really want. And here we find in the late Second Temple period, 1st century BC to 1st century CE or AD, that blue thread is still thriving with these groups. God doesn't want sacrifice. Read Isaiah 66. It's all there, right? Who can
Go
quote
and
it?
learn what this means.
Heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What's the house you'll build for me? To this person I will look, the one of a poor and contrite heart who trembles at my word. That's the new temple. But it's really not the new temple. It might even be the old temple. Don't get me off on the Hebrew Bible, but I could go on and on about that as well. And others, I think remember, these people think that the Hebrew Bible has been sown with tares. What does that mean? That within it, priestly interpolators have added things. You two have both talked a lot about that. And sometimes it's so obvious. I tell my students, ancient interpolators are really dumb. Boy, they're so dumb. There'll be a whole passage. My favorite is Psalm 51. I mean, any Christian knows it. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. But, on and on. We can quote the whole thing. You don't want sacrifice. And then at the end, dumb interpolator said, build the walls of Jerusalem, and then we will offer sacrifices, and you'll be pleased. Okay, sorry. We need a buzzer going beep, whenever we hear that. Isaiah 56, the same way. Solomon's prayer in the book of Kings. So we got this blue thread. Thank God we found a library, I keep holding this up, of a group that actually has now become so well known in the Western world. People haven't necessarily read the Dead Sea Scrolls, but if you just put Dead Sea Scrolls in the title of this podcast, you'll probably gain about 100,000 extra followers because people go, oh, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes, I love the Dead Sea Scrolls. But if you read them, you're going to be taken back into a movement to which they witness. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the way to start, is to ask, could we track? I love tracking Jesus. So could we track and discover and rediscover the strands of that blue thread that might be getting a little frayed by the late Second Temple period, because everything's the temple, the temple, the temple. And Herod builds this huge temple. And according to the prophets, it has no presence of God in it. It's an empty house. I even wonder if it looked like a Greek temple. Robert Eisenman has suggested that it probably just looked like the Acropolis, and maybe had some chambers in it that would sort of resemble the tabernacle. And we know it had some doors, but I'm talking about the pillars and the style and the gold and ornamentation. The tabernacle is just a little tent. I don't know if you've noticed, but the first tabernacle is just a tent Moses pitched outside the camp. It wasn't like poles and skins and all this, compound, and that came later. But the first thing is just a tent he would go in. And these groups believe that they can have the tent, they can bow their head anytime, and they can be in the tent, the presence. This is what they believe. Sounds Christian, doesn't it? some ways.